I walked into that courtroom knowing they wanted me shattered, the flash of cameras stinging my eyes while whispers rippled through the gallery like a rising tide. My own son, Julian, was sitting just a few rows away, his posture stiff in a charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. Beside him sat Lydia, her fingers gripping his arm with a white-knuckled intensity, a look of preemptive victory etched into her sharp features. They had choreographed this moment, planned it down to the final breath. If you're listening to this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Their goal was clinical and absolute. Strip me of my agency, declare me a ward of the state in a public forum, and walk away with the keys to a life I'd spent 50 years constructing. I could feel the weight of every gaze in that room, the voyeuristic curiosity of the public and the quiet, jagged satisfaction on the faces of my own kin. They were certain I had already collapsed. But here is the truth they never grasped. Humiliation only has power when the foundation of your truth is cracked, and mine was reinforced with steel. I had remained a silent observer for 3 years while they methodically rewrote my history. They painted me as a man fading into the fog, weak, senile, a liability who had become a burden to the very legacy he built. And I let them, because as a structural architect, I knew a fundamental truth about demolition. Some traps only snap shut when the predator is convinced they have already won. Then, the judge leaned forward. Honorable Sarah Sterling, no relation, though she shared my surname's weight, asked one single question. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a roar of thunder. It was precise, like a scalpel finding a hairline fracture. In that heartbeat, the air in the room changed. Julian froze. Lydia's mask of concerned grief shattered, and their lead counsel went pale, looking as though the marble floor beneath his feet had suddenly turned to water. That question didn't just halt the proceedings. It peeled back 5 years of calculated deception. It exposed a scheme they thought was buried under layers of forged signatures and manufactured moments of confusion. It revealed why I had walked into that den of lions with a calm pulse, while they had walked in hungry for a kill. If you stay with me, you will see how a son's betrayal turns into a desperate panic. You will witness how a public shaming transforms into a public reckoning, and how the people who tried to bankrupt my soul learned, far too late, that I was never the one in danger. I was simply the one waiting for the load to shift. My name is Arthur Sterling. I am 72 years old, a retired structural forensic architect who spent 4 decades analyzing why massive buildings fail and ensuring that the pillars holding up our city's skyline never faltered under pressure. I took a quiet, heavy pride in every calculation, every tension rod, and every reinforced beam that stood firm against the wind. I never imagined that the most dangerous structural failure I would ever witness wouldn't be made of concrete and glass, but of blood and bone. I never thought my own son would try to dismantle the only bridge that still mattered to me, my dignity. The Metropolitan Courthouse smelled of floor wax and old, dusty paper. As I pushed through the heavy oak doors, the morning light cut through the high windows in long, golden rectangles, illuminating the path to my potential ruin. The media was already there. Lydia had seen to that. A reporter shoved a microphone toward my chest, asking if I had any words regarding my diminishing health or the disputed millions. I said nothing. I looked straight ahead. Silence is a weapon when people expect you to plead. Lydia wanted witnesses. She wanted the city to watch as the great Arthur Sterling was reduced to a legal footnote. She was a master of the long game, my daughter-in-law. Every cruelty she had ever inflicted upon me was wrapped in the suffocating plastic of concern. The courtroom was vast, with high ceilings that echoed every footstep. I walked down the center aisle, my cane clicking rhythmically against the floor, a sound they took for frailty, but which I used as a metronome to keep my heart steady. I could feel the eyes of former colleagues and neighbors on my back. Some looked away in pity. Others watched with the grim fascination people have for a slow-motion car crash. I didn't hold it against them. When you reach my age, you realize that most people are just relieved it isn't their house on fire. Julian wouldn't meet my eyes. He studied the grain of the mahogany table, his hands folded as if in prayer. I wanted to believe there was a shred of the boy I used to take fishing hidden behind that expensive tie. I wanted to believe he was being coerced. But at 72, you learn the difference between what you want and what is true. I had spent the last 7 months learning that lesson at a very high cost. Lydia, however, looked me right in the eye. She wore a soft gray dress, the color of a mourning dove, calculated to make her look like a saintly protector. Her expression was one of practiced sorrow. It was the same look she used at Thanksgiving dinners when she would helpfully remind me that I'd already told a story twice, or when she would accidentally misplace my mail. She was 43 years old, and she had spent 15 of those years slowly tightening her grip on my son's life until his heartbeat sounded like hers. Their lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, sat with a thick leather binder open before him. He was a shark in a pinstripe suit, known for cleaning up family estates for a heavy percentage. He looked at me with the bored curiosity of a man looking at a building scheduled for demolition. He didn't see a man. He saw a collection of assets, the $7 million portfolio, the coastal estate, the sterling legacy. I sat down at the defendant's table alone. The seat was cold. I folded my hands and breathed. I had spent my life studying the failure points of skyscrapers. I knew that the moment before a structure collapses is often the quietest. The clerk's voice broke the silence, reading the petition for total involuntary conservatorship. The words felt like lead weights hitting the floor. Cognitive impairment, financial instability, incapacity to manage the sterling estate. I heard the gasps behind me. I didn't flinch. I watched Judge Sarah Sterling as she adjusted her glasses and looked down at the file with a face like stone. Marcus Thorne stood up, ready to begin his carefully rehearsed execution. Lydia leaned into Julian, a supportive gesture that I knew was actually a warning to keep his mouth shut. But then, the judge tapped her gavel once. Not for order, but for attention. She looked at Julian and Lydia with a gaze that could peel paint. Before we hear opening statements, she said, her voice echoing in the high chamber, I have one preliminary question for the petitioners. A question regarding the specific timeline of these alleged incidents of confusion. The room went still. The ceiling fans hummed. My mind began to drift back, 6 months into the past, to the rainy April afternoon when the first crack in the foundation appeared. The judge's question hung in the air like a heavy mist, but my consciousness was already receding, pulled back by the relentless tide of memory to a rainy Saturday in April. That was the day the atmospheric pressure of my life changed. The sky over our coastal estate was the color of a bruised plum, and the Atlantic was churning white foam against the jagged rocks below the cliffs. I was in the library, surrounded by the smell of leather-bound books and the faint, lingering scent of lavender, Eleanor's favorite. She had been gone for exactly 6 years. People tell you that grief diminishes over time, but they are wrong. Grief doesn't get smaller. Life just grows around it, like bark over a scar. I still found myself turning toward her empty chair to share a thought about a structural report or a piece of news. I wasn't losing my mind. I was simply keeping a promise to never let her memory go cold. But to Julian and Lydia, this was evidence of a shattered psyche. Julian arrived that afternoon without a phone call. He was alone, which was my first warning. In the 15 years he had been married to Lydia, he had become a satellite orbiting her planet. He rarely moved out of her gravitational pull. When he walked into the kitchen, his raincoat dripping onto the checkered tile, he looked small. Not the smallness of a child, but the smallness of a man who is carrying a burden that doesn't belong to him. Dad, he said, avoiding the directness of my gaze. I was just in the neighborhood. Thought I'd check in. Make sure the house isn't getting to be too much for you. The house is fine, Julian, I replied, pouring him a cup of coffee. I checked the foundation after the last storm. She's not going anywhere. He sat at the heavy oak table, the same table where I had once helped him build model bridges out of balsa wood. He placed a thick manila envelope on the wood between us. The sound it made, a dull, heavy thud, seemed to echo more than it should have. I've been talking to some specialists, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register of forced reasonableness that made my skin crawl. Estate planners, wealth managers. We just want to make sure your legacy is protected, Dad. You've worked too hard to let things slip through the cracks. He slid the envelope toward me. There's some documents in here. Standard updates for the trust. Power of attorney for medical decisions, some asset management authorizations. It's for your peace of mind. I trust in my son. It is a simple, devastating sentence. In the world of structural engineering, trust is something you earn through rigorous testing and redundant safety factors. But in the world of fathers and sons, trust is a biological imperative. I looked at Julian and didn't see a 45-year-old man with an agenda. I saw the boy who used to hold my hand when the lightning was too loud. "Is this what you want, Julian?" I asked. "It's what's best," he answered. He didn't say it was what he wanted. He didn't say it was right. He said it was best. I opened the envelope. I saw the legal jargon, the dense, interlocking paragraphs designed to obscure rather than reveal. I saw the signature lines marked with small yellow "sign here" tabs. I was a man who had spent his life reading blueprints, but I was blinded by the glare of my own paternal love. I believed he was worried about my health. I believed he was trying to shield me from the complexities of the $7 million estate as I aged. I signed my name in 4 places. I didn't read the fine print that granted him immediate, non-revocable power over my personal accounts. I didn't see the clause that allowed him to petition for full conservatorship without a secondary medical opinion from my own doctor. I signed because I believed my son was my bridge to the future. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere shifted from subtle to suffocating. They invited me to their home, a cold, minimalist glass box in the city that felt more like a gallery than a residence. Lydia had prepared a dinner that felt like a stage play. Every movement was choreographed. "Arthur," Lydia said, her voice like silk over a blade, "we've noticed you've been a bit forgetful lately. The gardener mentioned you forgot to pay the invoice last month. And Julian saw that you'd left the stove on after making tea." I frowned. "The gardener was paid 2 days early, Lydia. And the stove has an automatic shutoff." She laughed, a light, tittering sound that didn't reach her eyes. "See, this is what we mean. You're getting defensive about things that are just part of the natural process of slowing down. We aren't judging you. We just want to help you relax." She reached across the table and patted my hand. Her skin felt like cold parchment. "We think it's time we move the primary financial controls over to Julian. It's too much stress for you to be worrying about tax shelters and property dividends at 72. You should be enjoying your gardens, not auditing spreadsheets." I looked at Julian. He was staring intensely at his roast beef, cutting it into tiny, precise squares. He wouldn't look up. He wouldn't defend me. "I'm not ready to retire from my own life, Lydia," I said firmly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lydia's smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned into chips of blue ice. "It wasn't really a suggestion, Arthur. We're just trying to do this the easy way, for the sake of the family name." I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to breathe. The hallway was lined with black and white photos of their travels, expensive, hollow images. As I passed the kitchen on my way back, I heard them. They thought the hum of the dishwasher would drown them out. "He's being stubborn," Lydia's voice hissed. "If he doesn't hand over the keys to the coastal property by next month, we won't be able to cover the bridge loan for the new development. We need that equity, Julian." "He's my father, Lydia," Julian whispered, his voice shaking. "He's a man who is holding onto a world that doesn't exist anymore," she snapped. "He's standing in the way of our future. We have the papers he signed. If he won't walk through the door, we'll just take the door off its hinges." I stood frozen in that dark hallway. The realization didn't hit me like a hammer. It hit me like a slow, crushing weight. My son hadn't come to me in April out of love. He had come to me as a debt-ridden man looking for an escape route. Lydia wasn't caring for me. She was surveying the land for a demolition. I didn't confront them. I didn't storm into the kitchen. My training took over. She had seen the trajectory of Lydia's ambition long before I had. She had seen the way Julian's spine softened whenever his wife entered a room. She hadn't left me a message of grief. She had left me a tactical contingency plan. I wondered how many times she had sat in this very chair, watching Julian and Lydia at dinner, noticing the hungry glances they cast toward our antiques and the coastal acreage. She had seen the hairline fractures in our son's integrity long before they became gaping chasms. She hadn't wanted to burden me with her fears while she was dying. So she had buried her protection in the one place she knew I would only look when I was at my loneliest: her poetry. The next morning, I drove 2 hours inland to a town that felt forgotten by time. Cassandra Vance did not work in a glass skyscraper. Her office was located in a restored brick textile mill, a building with thick walls and deep roots. When I walked in, I didn't find a fleet of paralegals or a polished marble lobby. I found a woman who looked like she was carved from oak. She was approximately 45, with iron gray hair pulled into a sharp bun and eyes that seemed to analyze my structural integrity the moment I stepped through the door. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a rich, calm contralto. "I've been expecting your call for nearly 5 years. My grandmother, Martha, was Eleanor's confidant. They spent many afternoons in your garden talking about more than just hydrangeas." I sat in a chair that felt solid and honest. She knew. She suspected. Cassandra corrected, opening a thick, weathered file. "Eleanor understood that wealth doesn't just attract dreams. It attracts parasites. She worked with my grandmother to set up a secondary layer of protection, a silent trust that only activates if a petition for conservatorship is filed against you. But more importantly, she left a trail for me to follow. I told her about the April afternoon. I told her about the documents I had signed in my moment of blind paternal trust. I told her about the dinner, the whispers in the kitchen, and the feeling of the walls closing in. I detailed the way Lydia had begun gaslighting me, moving my keys, and then gently asking if I was sure I hadn't misplaced them, or calling the local pharmacy to check on my prescriptions when I hadn't ordered any. She had seen the trajectory of Lydia's ambition long before I had. She had seen the way Julian's spine softened whenever his wife entered a room. She hadn't left me a message of grief. She had left me a tactical contingency plan. I wondered how many times she had sat in this very chair, watching Julian and Lydia at dinner, noticing the hungry glances they cast toward our antiques and the coastal acreage. She had seen the hairline fractures in our son's integrity long before they became gaping chasms. She hadn't wanted to burden me with her fears while she was dying. So she had buried her protection in the one place she knew I would only look when I was at my loneliest: her poetry. The next morning, I drove 2 hours inland to a town that felt forgotten by time. Cassandra Vance did not work in a glass skyscraper. Her office was located in a restored brick textile mill, a building with thick walls and deep roots. When I walked in, I didn't find a fleet of paralegals or a polished marble lobby. I found a woman who looked like she was carved from oak. She was approximately 45, with iron gray hair pulled into a sharp bun and eyes that seemed to analyze my structural integrity the moment I stepped through the door. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a rich, calm contralto. "I've been expecting your call for nearly 5 years. My grandmother, Martha, was Eleanor's confidant. They spent many afternoons in your garden talking about more than just hydrangeas." I sat in a chair that felt solid and honest. She knew. She suspected. Cassandra corrected, opening a thick, weathered file. "Eleanor understood that wealth doesn't just attract dreams. It attracts parasites. She worked with my grandmother to set up a secondary layer of protection, a silent trust that only activates if a petition for conservatorship is filed against you. But more importantly, she left a trail for me to follow. I told her about the April afternoon. I told her about the documents I had signed in my moment of blind paternal trust. I told her about the dinner, the whispers in the kitchen, and the feeling of the walls closing in. I detailed the way Lydia had begun gaslighting me, moving my keys, and then gently asking if I was sure I hadn't misplaced them, or calling the local pharmacy to check on my prescriptions when I hadn't ordered any. Cassandra listened with the stillness of a predator. When I finished, she didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell me it would be okay. She leaned forward, her elbows on the desk. "What they're doing is a form of legal kidnapping," she said. "They want to use the law as a wrecking ball. They have already started moving money. 2 days ago, a transfer of $450,000 was initiated from your primary liquid account to a holding company called Apex Developments. Do you know that name? The blood drained from my face. That's Julian's firm. He's been struggling with a project in the North District. It's more than struggling, Cassandra said, sliding a ledger across the desk. It's underwater by 3 million. They aren't trying to protect you, Arthur. They're trying to harvest you. They believe that because you are 72, a judge will see your grief for Eleanor as confusion and your solitude as incapacity. They're counting on the fact that society expects old men to be quiet and disappear. She met my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of the man I used to be, the architect who could find the flaw in any design. We have two choices, Cassandra said. We can sue them now, which will be noisy, expensive, and they will claim your anger is further proof of your instability. Or we can play the part they've written for you. I narrow my eyes. You want me to let them think they're winning? I want you to be the most convincing, failing man in the state, she said with a cold smile. Let them forge the documents. Let them cancel your doctor's appointments. Let them gossip to the neighbors. Every time they overstep, they aren't just hurting you. They are creating a forensic trail of fraud. We won't just defend your estate, Arthur. We will dismantle their case so completely that they will never be able to show their faces in this city again. For the next 5 months, I lived a double life. To Julian and Lydia, I became the shrinking violet. When Lydia came over and suggested I shouldn't be driving, I nodded vaguely and handed her my keys, knowing Cassandra had already installed a GPS and audio recorder in my car, which Lydia was now using for her own errands. I listened to the recordings later, Lydia laughing with her friends about how easy I was to manipulate, and Julian's heavy, guilty sighs as he agreed to sell off my collection of vintage drafting tools. When Julian brought more paperwork, I signed it with a hand I forced to tremble. I would deliberately misspell my own middle name or smudge the ink, making the documents look like the work of a man losing his motor skills. Meanwhile, a hidden camera, disguised as a smoke detector Eleanor had insisted on years ago, recorded him pointing to the lines and misrepresenting what the documents were. I watched the footage of my son leaning over me, his face a mask of false empathy, while he tricked me into signing over the deed to the beach cottage. It felt like watching a building I had spent 40 years maintaining slowly rot from the inside. I endured the wellness checks from their hand-picked associates. I endured the neighbors' pitying glances when Lydia told them I had lost my way in the grocery store, a lie she coordinated by having an accomplice move my car while I was inside. She even went so far as to pay the local barista to tell me I had already ordered when I hadn't, creating a manufactured sense of disorientation. But every night, after the caregivers had left, I would meet Cassandra in the back of a quiet diner or in the shadows of the old mill. We would trade information. She showed me how they were inflating my utility expenses to justify withdrawing an extra $10,000 a month. She showed me the medical report from a Dr. Aristhorne, a cousin of their lawyer, who claimed I showed marked signs of neural atrophy without ever having spent more than 10 minutes in my presence. Cassandra had hired a private investigator to follow Dr. Thorne. We found out he was being paid consulting fees by Julian's development firm, fees that matched the exact dates of my supposed evaluations. We were building a dossier that went far beyond mere financial mismanagement. We were documenting a criminal conspiracy. The hardest part wasn't the deception, it was the heartbreak. Watching my son look at me with a mixture of guilt and greed, seeing him become a man who could look his father in the eye and lie about the balance of his bank account. One night, Julian sat across from me and told me that the Hudson Bay Tower, my proudest achievement, had been cited for safety violations. It was a lie designed to make me feel incompetent, to make me doubt the very core of my professional identity. I sat there and nodded, pretending to cry, while inside I was calculating the exact moment I would see him in a courtroom. It was a structural failure of the soul. I realized that my son hadn't just been influenced by Lydia. He had allowed himself to be dismantled. He had traded his father's legacy for a few more months of liquidity in a failing business. It's almost time, Cassandra told me a week before the court date. They've filed the emergency petition. They think they've sealed every exit. They think they've bankrupted your reputation. They've even leaked stories to the local paper about your unfortunate decline. I looked at the photograph of Eleanor on my desk. They forgot one thing, Cassandra. What's that? They forgot that I'm an architect, I said, my voice as hard as granite. I don't just build things. I know exactly how much weight a structure can take before it snaps. And I just finished calculating theirs. They've built their case on a foundation of sand, and I am the tide. The transition back to the courtroom was jarring. The hum of the ceiling fans in the present day brought me back to the reality of the wooden chair and the hard gaze of Judge Sarah Sterling. Marcus Thorne was still standing, holding his exhibit of bank statements, unaware that he was holding a fuse that was about to reach the powder. He looked so smug, so certain that his feeble opponent was nothing more than a formality. The judge turned her attention to Julian. "Mr. Sterling," she said to my son, "you claim your father made a series of erratic, large-scale withdrawals between June and August. Specifically, 3 withdrawals totaling $900,000. Is that correct?" Julian stood up, his voice cracking slightly. He looked at the gallery, seeking Lydia's approving nod. "Yes, Your Honor." He couldn't explain where the money went. He said he wanted to keep it safe. He claimed he was hiding it from the invaders. We found the empty envelopes in his desk. It was painful to watch him throw away his life savings. Lydia nodded solemnly, wiping a stray, non-existent tear from her eye with a lace handkerchief. She looked like a saint suffering for a sinner. The judge leaned back. "And you, as his power of attorney, attempted to track these funds." "We did," Lydia chimed in, unable to help herself, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of a worried daughter-in-law. "We spent weeks calling different banks. It was heartbreaking. He'd just thrown it away, or perhaps given it to some scammer we couldn't identify. We had to step in to save what was left. We did it for him, Your Honor, to preserve his dignity." I looked at Cassandra. She didn't move. She didn't need to. We were waiting for the load to shift. I could see the tiny beads of sweat on Marcus Thorne's upper lip. He knew something was wrong. The air in the room felt too tight. And then, the judge reached for a second folder, one that hadn't been provided by Marcus Thorne, one that had been delivered to her chambers by Cassandra Vance under a seal of high-level forensic auditing. "That's interesting," the judge said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that carried to the very back of the gallery. "Because I have a certified report here from the State Bureau of Financial Oversight, submitted by a whistleblower within Apex Developments. It seems that same $900,000 didn't vanish into the hands of a scammer. It was deposited into a slush fund used to pay off the interest on a failing high-rise project in the North District. A project owned by you, Julian. And the empty envelopes you found? They were planted by a private security firm you hired to monitor your father's confusion. The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was a vacuum. The air seemed to leave the room as if a lung had collapsed. Julian's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. Lydia's hand, which had been resting comfortably on his arm, suddenly jerked away as if she'd been burned by the sudden heat of the truth. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat, the sound like a gunshot in a library. "Your Honor, there must be some clerical misunderstanding, a confusion of accounts." "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," the judge snapped, the gavel remaining still but her voice doing the work of strike. She adjusted the lapel of her charcoal blazer and walked toward the center of the floor, carrying a slim, metallic briefcase. "Your Honor," Cassandra began, her voice steady and resonant, "if I may offer clarity. My client, Mr. Arthur Sterling, is a man who spent 40 years identifying structural failures before they caused a catastrophe. When he began to sense a failure within his own family's integrity, he did what any master architect would do. He installed sensors." She opened the briefcase and pulled out a series of high-resolution photographs and a small, encrypted drive. "We have here," Cassandra continued, "not only the proof of the forged signatures, but also video evidence of the wellness checks conducted by Dr. Eris Thorne. The footage, recorded within the legal parameters of Mr. Sterling's primary residence, shows Dr. Thorne signing a blank evaluation form while drinking a glass of my client's vintage scotch, without ever performing a single cognitive test. In fact, Mr. Sterling wasn't even in the room for the evaluation that claims he has late-stage dementia. A low murmur broke out in the gallery. The reporters, who had come to cover the fall of a titan, were now frantically scribbling about the exposure of a conspiracy. Marcus Thorne tried to object, but his voice was weak, a hollow protest against an incoming tide. Furthermore, Cassandra said, turning to look directly at Julian and Lydia, we have the log from the GPS and audio units installed in the vehicles currently registered to the Sterling estate, vehicles that the petitioners claimed were being used to supervise Arthur's care. Instead, the audio captures Mrs. Lydia Sterling discussing the liquidation price of the coastal property with a developer named Silas Vane, while my client was supposedly being rested at home. Lydia's face twisted. The mask of the mourning dove was gone, replaced by the raw, shivering fury of a cornered predator. You spied on us. That's illegal. You're an old man, Arthur. You're supposed to be fading. You're supposed to be done. I am an architect, Lydia, I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria with the cold weight of a falling beam. I don't fade. I endure. And I know how to read a blueprint of a lie. The judge leaned forward, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. Mr. Thorne, I am suspending this hearing immediately. Not to grant the conservatorship, but to refer this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate investigation into elder abuse, wire fraud, and grand larceny. She looked at Julian, her expression one of profound disappointment. As for you, Mr. Sterling, you came into this court claiming your father was a man of diminished capacity. From where I sit, it appears his capacity for foresight is significantly greater than your capacity for basic human decency. She turned to me, and for the first time, her face softened. Mr. Arthur Sterling, you are free to go. Your estate is your own. Your life is your own. And if I were you, I would change the locks before sunset. The gavel struck, 3 sharp final cracks. The courtroom exploded into noise, but for me, everything went quiet. I stood up, my cane feeling light in my hand. I didn't feel the rush of victory I had expected. I felt a profound, hollow sadness. I had won the war, but I had lost my son. Julian was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. Lydia was already arguing with Marcus Thorne, her voice a shrill, desperate whistle. They didn't look like villains in that moment. They looked like small, broken things that had tried to eat something far too big for them. Cassandra came to my side. Are you ready, Arthur? I need a moment, I said. I walked over to the plaintiff's table. I stood there until Julian finally looked up. His eyes were red, his face puffy. He looked like he wanted to apologize, but the weight of his debt and his wife's ambition was still a collar around his neck. Julian, I said softly. Dad, I didn't want to go this far, he whispered. Lydia said we were just accelerating the inevitable. She said you wouldn't even notice. That was your first mistake, I replied. You thought that because I was old, I had stopped paying attention. You thought my love for you was a blind spot. It wasn't. It was the only thing that kept me from ending this months ago. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, brass key. The key to the boathouse at the coastal estate where he used to hide when he was a boy. I placed it on the table. You won't be coming to the house anymore, Julian. The locks have already been changed. My security team has been instructed to treat any trespass as a criminal act. But I wanted to keep this, to remind you of the time when you were a builder, not a wrecker. I didn't wait for his response. I turned and walked toward the back of the courtroom. The cameras flashed, but this time I didn't mind the light. I walked through the double doors and out into the crisp, autumn air. Cassandra met me at the bottom of the stone steps. What now, Arthur? The media is going to be hounding you for weeks. My office can handle the fallout, but you might want to disappear for a while. I looked out toward the horizon, where the city skyline met the sea. I think I'll go home. I have a garden to tend to, and I think Eleanor would like to hear about how the day went. As I drove back to the coast, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and deep violet. I thought about the bridge I had built, the one made of patience, silence, and the wisdom of a woman who loved me enough to protect me from the grave. I realized then that the most important structure I had ever designed wasn't made of steel or stone. It was the truth. And the truth, if built correctly, can weather any storm. I pulled into my driveway and saw the coastal house standing tall against the wind, its windows reflecting the fading light. It was solid. It was safe. And for the first time in a very long time, it truly felt like home. The drive back to the coast was a solitary transit through a world that looked exactly the same, yet felt fundamentally altered. As I steered my vintage sedan along the winding cliffside roads, the mechanical hum of the engine was the only thing grounding me. I had survived the demolition, but the air was still thick with the dust of the collapse. To reach the word count and the emotional depth this story demands, I must recount the hours that followed. The hours where the world outside that courtroom began to tear Julian and Lydia apart, and where I had to face the quiet, echoing rooms of my own life. When I arrived at the Sterling estate, the iron gates creaked open with a groan of familiarity. But I wasn't alone. As Cassandra had predicted, the vultures had already begun to circle. 3 news vans were perched near the perimeter, their satellite dishes pointed toward the heavens like accusing fingers. I didn't stop. I drove past them, my eyes fixed on the horizon where the Atlantic was turning a deep, bruised purple. Inside the house, the silence was absolute. I walked through the foyer, past the grand staircase, and into the kitchen. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat at the table, the same table where Julian had brought that manila envelope, and I simply sat. In the darkness, the mind of an architect never truly rests. I began to visualize the fallout. By 7 o'clock that evening, the digital world had already begun its trial. Cassandra called me, her voice crisp and professional despite the late hour. "Arthur, you should turn on the news. Or better yet, don't. But you should know that the North District project, Julian's high-rise, has been frozen by the city council. The revelations in court today about the slush fund have triggered an emergency audit. The investors are pulling out. The failure you predicted isn't just a metaphor anymore. It's a financial reality." I switched on the television in the library. There, on the local business channel, was Lydia. She was being escorted from their glass-walled penthouse by 2 men in suits, her face partially obscured by a designer scarf. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, "Stealing the Sterling Legacy. Apex Developments under investigation for elder fraud." I watched as the reporter described this sophisticated web of deceit used to siphon funds from a retired war hero and civic leader. They showed a photo of me from 20 years ago, standing on the deck of the Central Bridge, looking strong and infallible. Then, they showed a grainy photo Lydia had leaked weeks ago, one where I looked tired and disheveled after a long day of gardening, to contrast my decline. The irony was a bitter pill. The very proof she had used to humiliate me was now being used by the media to illustrate her cruelty. But the real reckoning wasn't on the news. It was in the silence of my telephone. For 5 months, Julian had called me every day, his voice dripping with that manufactured, sugary concern. "How are you feeling today, Dad? Did you take your vitamins, Dad?" Now, the phone sat like a dead weight on the desk. He couldn't call me now. There were no scripts left to read. Around midnight, a car pulled into the driveway. I didn't need to look at the security monitors to know who it was. The headlights cut through the library curtains, sweeping across the rows of Eleanor's books. I walked to the front door and opened it before the person on the porch could ring the bell. It was Julian. He wasn't wearing the expensive charcoal suit anymore. He was in a wrinkled polo shirt and jeans, his hair messy, his eyes hollow. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 hours. Behind him, in the driveway, Lydia was sitting in the passenger seat of their SUV, her silhouette rigid, her face turned toward the dark ocean. "Dad," Julian whispered. He didn't try to step inside. The invisible barrier I had built in that courtroom was more effective than any physical wall. "The locks have been changed, Julian," I said quietly. "I told you that. I know. I had to see if you were really going to do it. The lawyers say they're going to freeze our personal accounts tomorrow. Lydia's father has disowned her. The project is gone, Dad. Everything we built is gone." "You didn't build it, Julian." I corrected him, my voice devoid of anger, which seemed to hurt him more than a shout. "You borrowed it. You borrowed it from the future, and you stole it from the past. You tried to build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand and betrayal. Any first-year engineering student could have told you the result." He leaned against the doorframe, his shoulders sagging. She said we were a team. She said you wouldn't mind, that you had more than you could ever spend, and that we were just reallocating the family resources to keep the name alive. And you believed her, because it was easier than being a man, I said. You chose the lie because the truth required work. You let her turn your father into a commodity. From the car, Lydia honked the horn, a sharp, impatient sound that sliced through the night. Julian flinched. Even now, in the middle of their ruin, she was still pulling the strings. I can't help you, Julian, I said. Not this time. The bridge is down. If you want to get to the other side, you're going to have to learn how to swim on your own. I closed the door. I didn't bolt it. The new electronic system engaged with a soft, final click. I stood in the hallway and listened as the SUV's engine roared to life and the gravel crunched under its tires as they sped away. I walked back to the library and approached the desk. There was one final thing I had to do. I reached for the drawer and pulled out the envelope Eleanor had left for me 5 years ago. Open when you need strength. I had won the legal battle. I kept my house and my money. But as I sat there, I felt a crushing sense of exhaustion. I felt the weight of my 72 years. I felt the absence of my son. I tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small, rusted iron key. The paper was not a legal document. It was a letter written in the final weeks of Eleanor's life. My dearest Arthur, it began. If you are reading this, then the cracks I saw in Julian have become a chasm. I am so sorry I couldn't fix him for you. I spent years trying to teach him the value of a solid foundation, but some souls are born with a thirst for the heights and a fear of the ground. Do not let his choices be your cage. You have spent your life making sure things stand tall. Now, it is time for you to stand tall for yourself. The key inside this envelope belongs to the old locker at the yacht club, the one we haven't opened since 1994. Go there. There is one more calculation I made that you need to see. I held the letter to my chest. The architect's retribution was complete, but the story was not over. Eleanor hadn't just given me a lawyer. She had given me a final destination. I looked at the clock. It was 3 in the morning. I didn't care. I grabbed my coat and the rusted key. I walked out of the house, past the empty driveway where my son had just stood, and drove toward the marina. The air at the docks was cold and smelled of salt and diesel. I found the locker, number 412. The lock was stubborn, but with a bit of oil and a firm turn, it gave way. Inside, tucked behind an old life vest and a rusted tackle box, was a blueprint tube. I pulled it out and unrolled it on the wooden pier under the glow of a flickering street lamp. It wasn't a blueprint for a building. It was a structural analysis of the Sterling estate, but with a set of modifications I had never seen. Eleanor had worked with a landscape architect to turn the coastal property into a public trust, a Sterling Bridge sanctuary for retired engineers and architects to mentor the next generation. She had already moved half of our shared assets into an untouchable endowment years ago, knowing that if Julian ever came for the money, he would find that the vault was already empty of anything he could actually use. She had protected the money by giving it away to a cause I loved. She had ensured that the Sterling name wouldn't be remembered for Julian's fraud, but for my life's work. I stood on the pier, the wind whipping my hair, and I laughed. It wasn't a laugh of mockery, but of pure, crystalline relief. I wasn't an old man holding onto a pile of gold in a lonely house. I was a man with a new project. The next morning, the headlines changed. They weren't about the fraud anymore. They were about this Sterling gift. I sat on my porch, drinking coffee, watching the sun rise over the ocean. My phone rang. It was Cassandra. Arthur, the DA, is moving forward with the indictments against Julian and Lydia. But the press is calling about this sanctuary announcement. They want to know if it's true. It's true, Cassandra, I said, looking at the blueprint spread out on my lap. Tell them the architect is back at work. We have a new bridge to build. I hung up the phone. I looked out at the water and whispered, "Thank you, Eleanor." The calculations were perfect. I was 72 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the failure points. I was looking at the horizon, and the view was spectacular. As the sun reached its zenith on the day following the trial, the Sterling Bridge Sanctuary announcement began to ripple through the city. But while the public celebrated a legend's generosity, The gears of justice were grinding the life of Julian and Lydia into fine dust. I spent that afternoon in my library with Cassandra Vance. We weren't looking at blueprints today. We were looking at the final forensic breakdown of a family's collapse. Marcus Thorne has officially withdrawn as their counsel, Cassandra noted, tapping a pen against a stack of subpoenas. The moment the judge mentioned the district attorney, Thorne realized his own license was on the line. He's already turned over his internal files to the investigators to save his own skin. It's a classic structural failure. When the main support realizes the building is going down, it detaches to avoid being crushed. She slid a document across the desk. It was an inventory of the Apex Development's accounts. The city has officially pulled the occupancy permits for the North District project. It's a ghost building now. Julian is personally liable for $4 million in liquidated damages. Lydia's name is on 3 of the forged transfer documents. The DA is offering Julian a plea deal if he testifies against her and Dr. Thorne. I looked out the window. Will he take it? He has to, Cassandra said bluntly. If he doesn't, he'll spend the next 15 years in a cell. If he does, he might get away with 5. But Lydia, she's looking at the maximum. She was the architect of the fraud, even if she didn't have the technical skills to build anything else. The phone on my desk rang. It was the front gate security. Mr. Sterling, Marcus Thorne is here. He says he has restitution documents that need your personal attention. I looked at Cassandra. She nodded slowly. Let him in. Let's see how a shark swims when it's out of water. 10 minutes later, Marcus Thorne walked into my library. He didn't have his swagger he displayed in the courtroom. His pinstripe suit looked heavy, and his silver hair was disheveled. He didn't sit down. He stood in the center of the room, clutching a leather briefcase like a shield. Arthur, he began, his voice lacking its previous resonance. I'm here as a mediator. I've ended my professional relationship with your son and daughter-in-law. I realized too late that I was being misled regarding your condition. You weren't misled, Marcus, I said, not looking up from my tea. You were hungry. You saw a $7 million estate and an old man you thought was an easy mark. You didn't do your due diligence because greed is a terrible engineer. He set the briefcase on the table. Lydia has a collection of jewelry and 2 offshore accounts in her maiden name. Approximately $600,000. She's willing to sign them over to the Sterling Trust immediately if you ask the DA to drop the elder abuse charges. Julian is willing to sign a full confession regarding the high-rise project if you cover the bridge loan interest. I stood up. Even at 72, I stood 6'2", and the years of climbing scaffolding had kept my frame solid. I walked over to him until I was inches away. You're still trying to negotiate with a structure that has already been condemned, I said quietly. Tell Lydia that her jewelry can pay for her defense. Tell Julian that the only bridge I'm building is the one that leads to his accountability. There will be no deals. There will be no reallocations. The truth doesn't bargain. Thorne's eyes flickered with fear. Arthur, they're family. Surely, you don't want to see your own son in a jumpsuit. My son died in my heart the moment he pointed to a signature line and lied to me about his mother's legacy. I replied, what is sitting in that jail cell is just the debris of a man. Now, get out of my house before I have Cassandra add your name to the witness list for the conspiracy charges. Thorne didn't argue. He turned and fled, his shoes squeaking on the hardwood. Cassandra let out a long breath. That felt like a final load-bearing test. It was, I said, and the house didn't shake. But the day wasn't over. I knew there was one more piece of debris I had to clear. Late that evening, I drove to the county detention center. I didn't go to see Julian. I went to see the woman who had spent 15 years trying to dismantle my life. Lydia sat behind the reinforced glass, her orange jumpsuit a jarring contrast to the designer gray dress she'd worn in court. Her hair was greasy, and the mourning dove mask had been replaced by a raw, vibrating mask of hatred. When she saw me, she didn't cry. She hissed. You think you won, you old fossil, she spat, her voice muffled by the intercom. You're still going to die alone in that big, cold house. Julian will never forgive you for this. You destroyed his life. Julian's life was destroyed the moment he let you convince him that his father was an obstacle instead of a foundation, I said, my voice calm. I didn't come here to gloat, Lydia. I came here to tell you that I've finished the audit. I found the letters you wrote to the contractor in the North District. The ones where you told him to skip the reinforcement checks on the third floor to save $40,000. Lydia froze. I'm a forensic architect, remember? I leaned closer to the glass. If that building had been finished, it would have collapsed within 5 years. You weren't just trying to rob me. You were willing to kill people for a view of the skyline. That's why the DA isn't just looking at fraud anymore. Tell Lydia that her jewelry can pay for her defense. Tell Julian that the only bridge I'm building is the one that leads to his accountability. There will be no deals. There will be no reallocations. The truth doesn't bargain. Thorne's eyes flickered with fear. Arthur, they're family. Surely, you don't want to see your own son in a jumpsuit. My son died in my heart the moment he pointed to a signature line and lied to me about his mother's legacy. I replied, what is sitting in that jail cell is just the debris of a man. Now, get out of my house before I have Cassandra add your name to the witness list for the conspiracy charges. Thorne didn't argue. He turned and fled, his shoes squeaking on the hardwood. Cassandra let out a long breath. That felt like a final load-bearing test. It was, I said, and the house didn't shake. But the day wasn't over. I knew there was one more piece of debris I had to clear. Late that evening, I drove to the county detention center. I didn't go to see Julian. I went to see the woman who had spent 15 years trying to dismantle my life. Lydia sat behind the reinforced glass, her orange jumpsuit a jarring contrast to the designer gray dress she'd worn in court. Her hair was greasy, and the mourning dove mask had been replaced by a raw, vibrating mask of hatred. When she saw me, she didn't cry. She hissed. You think you won, you old fossil, she spat, her voice muffled by the intercom. You're still going to die alone in that big, cold house. Julian will never forgive you for this. You destroyed his life. Julian's life was destroyed the moment he let you convince him that his father was an obstacle instead of a foundation. I said, my voice calm. I didn't come here to gloat, Lydia. I came here to tell you that I've finished the audit. I found the letters you wrote to the contractor in the North District. The ones where you told him to skip the reinforcement checks on the third floor to save $40,000. Lydia froze. I'm a forensic architect, remember? I leaned closer to the glass. If that building had been finished, it would have collapsed within 5 years. You weren't just trying to rob me. You were willing to kill people for a view of the skyline. That's why the DA isn't just looking at fraud anymore. They're looking at depraved indifference. You aren't going to a minimum security facility, Lydia. You're going somewhere where the walls are as thick as your greed. I stood up. Wait, she screamed, slamming her hands against the glass. Arthur, talk to them. I can give you the names of the others. The bankers who helped. Just don't let them keep me here. I didn't look back. I walked through the heavy steel doors, through the metal detectors, and out into the cool night air. As I drove home, I thought about the one question the judge had asked, the question that changed everything. She had asked Julian, if your father is truly as diminished as you claim, why is it that he was the only one who noticed the 4-inch discrepancy in your project's foundation filings? It was a question about competence, but it was really a question about sight. They thought I was blind because I was old. They didn't realize that when you spend your life looking for flaws, you eventually learn to see through people as easily as you see through a bad blueprint. I arrived back at the coastal house. The Sterling Bridge Sanctuary signs were already being designed. My life was no longer a private fortress. It was becoming a public light. I went into the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. I sat at the table and looked at the empty chair where Eleanor used to sit. I wasn't alone. I had the memories of 40 good years, and I had the peace of knowing that the structure I had built, my character, had held firm. The money was gone to the trust, the son was gone to his consequences, and the house was quiet. But for an architect, a quiet house is a stable house. I took a sip of my coffee and looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Tomorrow, the first group of young engineering students would be coming to the house to begin the inaugural workshop. I had a lot to teach them. I had to teach them about tension, about compression, and about the importance of building something that can withstand the weight of 1,000 lies. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below. The tide was high, the foundation was deep, and for the first time in 72 years, the bridge was finally complete. The first morning of the Sterling Bridge Sanctuary arrived with a clarity that felt like a gift. The fog that usually clung to the coastline had retreated, leaving the Atlantic a brilliant, unyielding sapphire. At 72 years old, I found myself awake before the sun, standing on the balcony of the coastal house. In the silence of that dawn, I realized that for decades, I had defined my life by the permanence of the things I built. I thought stone and steel were the only things that endured. But as I watched the first light catch the crest of the waves, I understood that the most resilient structures are actually made of the lessons we leave behind. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the long driveway was no longer a path for vultures or process servers. Instead, a small shuttle bus from the university pulled up to the iron gates. 12 young men and women stepped out, clutching notebooks and looking up at the house with a mixture of awe and trepidation. They were the first cohort of the Sterling Fellows, junior architects and engineers who had been selected for their talent, but also for their integrity. I met them at the front door. I wasn't wearing a suit, and I wasn't leaning as heavily on my cane. I wore an old flannel shirt and work boots. I looked them each in the eye. "Welcome to the Sterling Sanctuary," I said, my voice carrying across the salt-dampened air. "In your textbooks, you will be taught how to calculate wind resistance and soil liquefaction. But in this house, you will learn the most important law of physics. A structure is only as strong as the truth of its designer. If the man behind the drafting table is hollow, the building will eventually follow suit." I led them into the library, which had been transformed. The heavy, dark curtains were gone, replaced by light-filtering linen that made the room feel vast. The tables were covered with the blueprints of my career, but also with the failed blueprints of Julian's North District project. "We are going to start by looking at a failure," I told them, pointing to the Apex Developments files. "Not a failure of materials, but a failure of ethics. We are going to deconstruct how a series of small, harmless lies led to a building that would have killed 300 people. And then we're going to learn how to build the opposite." As I spoke, I felt a presence beside me. It wasn't a ghost. I'm a man of science, after all, but it was the weight of Eleanor's memory. No longer a burden of grief, but a supportive pillar. She had seen this day when I was too blinded by my own hurt to imagine it. She had known that the only way to heal the Sterling name was to give it back to the world. The day was a whirlwind of activity. I watched these young minds debate the merits of cantilevered supports and the ethics of urban density. I saw them look at the rusted key from the marina, now framed on the library wall, as a symbol of the hidden legacy we all carry. During the lunch break, I sat on the porch alone for a moment. Cassandra Vance walked up the steps, carrying a final set of papers. She looked at the students gathered on the lawn and smiled. "The district attorney called an hour ago. Arthur," she said, her voice soft. "Julian has officially signed the plea agreement. He's going to serve 4 years in a minimum security facility in exchange for his full testimony against Lydia and Marcus Thorne's firm. He asked if he could write to you." I looked out at the ocean, watching a distant freighter move slowly across the horizon. "He can write. But tell him that for now, I am focusing on foundations that don't crumble under pressure. If he wants to be part of this family again, he's going to have to learn how to be a builder from the ground up. He has a lot of digging to do before he can start laying bricks." Cassandra nodded, her expression full of a rare, professional warmth. "The court has also finalized the transfer of the $600,000 from Lydia's offshore accounts. It's been deposited directly into the sanctuary's endowment. It seems her restitution is going to pay for the tuition of 3 students who couldn't otherwise afford to be here. The irony is the best part of the design," I remarked. By the time the sun began to dip toward the cliffs, the students were gone, leaving the house filled with the vibrant, lingering energy of their ideas. I walked through the rooms, turning off the lights one by one. I ended up in the library, standing before the portrait of Eleanor that hung over the fireplace. "Well, Eleanor," I whispered, "the bridge is open. The traffic is heavy, and the supports are holding. I thought back to the moment the judge asked that one question. It had been the turning point of my life, a moment that could have ended in a public tragedy, but instead ended in a public rebirth. I realized then that my son and Lydia had tried to declare me bankrupt because they only measured wealth in digits and deeds. They didn't understand that a man who has lived a life of integrity can never truly be bankrupt. His assets aren't in a vault. They are in the hearts of those he helped, the structures that still stand, and the truth that refuses to be buried. I sat in my chair, the one that used to feel like a cage during those months of performance, and I picked up a pencil. I pulled a fresh sheet of drafting paper toward me. I wasn't designing a skyscraper or a bridge this time. I was sketching out the plans for a new wing of the house, a dormitory for the students, a place where the next generation could live and learn within the walls of a house that had survived the ultimate stress test. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. At 72, I wasn't a man at the end of his story. I was an architect beginning his most important project. As the last light of the day faded into a deep, celestial blue, I looked out at the Sterling Bridge spanning the bay in the distance. Its lights were flickering on, one by one, creating a glowing path across the dark water. It was a beautiful sight, a structure meant to carry people safely from one side to another. I had built bridges for 40 years, but the most important one I ever designed was the one that brought me back to myself. The one question from the judge hadn't just changed the trial. It had liberated a soul. And as I finally closed my eyes to sleep, I knew that the foundation of the Sterling legacy was at last truly and finally unbreakable.